The world that gives rise to Jean Grey does not announce its fracture. It presents itself as ordered, disciplined, and carefully contained. Power exists, but it is regulated. Difference exists, but it is managed. The social terrain is divided into centers and margins, into institutions that claim guardianship and forces that must be supervised. In this landscape, extraordinary ability is tolerated only when it remains legible, predictable, and subordinate to an external moral frame. Jean enters this world not as a disruption, but as a promise. She is framed as harmony rather than threat. Her presence reassures the system that power can be elegant, obedient, and aesthetically acceptable. She is cultivated within walls designed to transform volatility into service. What emerges is not autonomy, but refinement. Not freedom, but permission. The environment teaches her how to stand in the light without burning the structure that shines it. From the outside, this appears benevolent. A gifted individual is offered guidance, protection, and purpose. Yet embedded in this arrangement is a quiet condition. Power is welcomed only if it consents to limitation. Strength is celebrated only when it mirrors the values of those who regulate it. The stage is prepared long before Jean understands that she is standing on it. Her abilities are described as immense, but the language surrounding them remains cautious. The vocabulary of potential is paired with the grammar of restraint. What matters is not how far her reach extends, but how gently she is expected to hold it. The system does not fear power itself. It fears power that does not ask for approval. This is where the phoenix waits, not as a character, not yet as a force, but as pressure. It exists as a gravitational field beneath the narrative surface, bending every rule that attempts to contain Jean. It is not foreign to her. It is not an invasion. It is the part of her that cannot be educated into submission, the part that refuses to remain ornamental. Before the crisis, the phoenix is invisible because the world is not yet ready to name it. It appears instead as excess, as moments where Jean surpasses what is required, as a surplus of perception, of intensity, of presence. These moments are quietly corrected, redirected, explained away. The system rewards her compliance and praises her restraint, reinforcing the belief that control is synonymous with maturity. Desire operates here as an unspoken variable. Jean is allowed to want, but only within boundaries that do not threaten the collective balance. Her emotional life is framed as something to be managed, something that might destabilize her clarity if left unchecked. Desire becomes suspect when it moves independently of duty. It is here that fear begins its work. The fear is not of destruction. It is of authorship. A woman who possesses overwhelming power and names her own trajectory disrupts the architecture of control more profoundly than any external enemy. The phoenix does not merely increase Jean's strength. It removes the need for mediation. It collapses the distance between impulse and action, between will and consequence. In the early world, this collapse has not yet occurred. Instead, the narrative invests in delay, in training, in protocols, in assurances that everything is under control. Jean herself internalizes this rhythm. She learns to monitor her own magnitude, to soften her presence, to keep her intensity legible. She becomes skilled at self-surveillance. The stage functions smoothly because everyone believes in it. The mentors believe they are protecting her. The community believes it is preserving order. Jean believes that containment equals safety. The audience is invited to share this belief, to see restraint as wisdom and obedience as growth. The conflict remains structural rather than explicit. What is not acknowledged is that this structure depends on denial. The phoenix is not an external catastrophe waiting to strike. It is the accumulation of all that has been postponed. every instinct deferred, every desire reframed, every boundary accepted without question. The pressure builds not through rebellion, but through compliance. There is a particular quiet to this phase of the story. It is the calm of a sealed chamber. Nothing appears broken. Nothing appears wrong. Yet the walls are already bearing weight beyond their design. The system praises itself for stability, while ignoring the cost at which it is maintained. Jean's identity is shaped in relation to others. She is defined through usefulness, through relational harmony, through her capacity to support rather than dominate. Her power is interpreted as something that must be balanced by emotional softness. Strength is allowed, but only when tempered by care. Autonomy is reframed as danger. The phoenix complicates this arrangement because it refuses to separate force from desire. It does not ask whether its intensity is appropriate. It does not pause to consider whether its expansion makes others uncomfortable. It operates according to a different logic, one that does not privilege consensus over truth. In this early stage, the phoenix is a rumor, a potential future, a threat that has not yet earned its name. The narrative holds it at a distance, allowing the audience to remain within the comfort of familiar hierarchies. The illusion of balance persists, but the conditions for rupture are already in place. The center is over-fortified. The margins are compressed. Jean stands at the intersection of expectation and magnitude, praised for her control and quietly punished for her depth. The system believes it has secured its foundation. It has not. The phoenix does not arrive to destroy a peaceful world. It emerges because the world was never neutral. It was always arranged to favor containment over transformation. The opening sequence ends not with an explosion, but with a realization. The crisis has already begun. It simply has not been named yet. Jean Grey is introduced into her narrative universe as a figure of alignment rather than disruption. Her origins are framed through harmony, balance, and latent promise. From the beginning, she is positioned as someone whose immense capacity must be carefully guided, not unleashed. The language surrounding her emergence emphasizes care, instruction, and containment, as if power without structure were inherently dangerous. This framing is not accidental. It reflects a cultural anxiety that predates her existence and merely finds in her a suitable vessel. Her early life is defined less by what she does than by how others respond to what she might become. Institutions gather around her quickly. Systems of observation and protection are installed. She is never left alone with her own magnitude. This constant proximity of authority constructs a psychological environment in which identity is shaped in response to supervision. Jean learns who she is by observing how others react to her presence. Power becomes relational before it becomes personal. At the foundation of this dynamic lies a subtle inversion. Jean is told she is special, yet this distinction is paired with an insistence on restraint. She is exceptional, but not sovereign. Her abilities elevate her status while simultaneously justifying greater control over her choices. This dual movement creates a quiet fracture between internal experience and external role. She is encouraged to see herself as gifted, but also as someone who must never fully trust her own instincts. The phoenix enters this structure not as mythology, but as unresolved tension. Symbolically, it represents what remains unincorporated within Jean's sanctioned identity. It is the surplus that cannot be assimilated into the existing order. The phoenix is not chaos in opposition to reason. It is intensity in excess of permission. Its presence signals that something within Jean does not consent to being reduced to function. Desire becomes the first fault line. Jean's emotional life is treated as a variable that could destabilize her clarity. Affection, longing, anger, and ambition are closely monitored, framed as potential triggers rather than sources of knowledge. The narrative teaches that emotional intensity threatens rational control, especially when housed within extraordinary power. As a result, Jean learns to experience her own desire with caution, sometimes even suspicion. This suspicion is reinforced by relational dynamics that reward her self-moderation. She is valued as a stabilizing force, a psychic anchor for others. Her role becomes that of a center, absorbing turbulence rather than generating it. This positioning flatters her sense of belonging while quietly extracting a cost. To remain loved, she must remain legible. To remain trusted, she must remain contained. The Phoenix challenges this economy by collapsing the distance between feeling and force. Where Jean has been taught to filter her impulses through layers of approval, the Phoenix acts without mediation. It does not separate intention from effect. In doing so, it exposes a truth the system prefers not to confront. That control has never eliminated danger. It has merely displaced it inward. The origins of the Phoenix are deliberately ambiguous, because clarity would threaten the moral architecture of the narrative. If the Phoenix were clearly external, it could be treated as invasion. If it were clearly internal, it would force a reckoning with repression. Instead, it occupies a liminal space, neither wholly other nor entirely self. This ambiguity allows the surrounding world to oscillate between fascination and fear without committing to responsibility. Jean's mentors function as interpreters of legitimacy. They define what counts as growth and what counts as regression. Their guidance is sincere, but shaped by inherited assumptions about power and gender. They believe in discipline because they believe discipline prevents catastrophe. What they fail to see is how discipline can also manufacture it by denying power the possibility of conscious integration. Psychologically, Jean's development unfolds within a narrow corridor. She is permitted strength that serves collective stability, but discouraged from strength that asserts independent direction. Her identity becomes organized around service, loyalty, and emotional availability. These traits are not imposed violently. They are cultivated through praise and belonging. This makes them harder to question. The Phoenix, by contrast, does not seek belonging. It seeks expression. It is not interested in approval or harmony. It embodies expansion without negotiation. This is why it is read as dangerous long before it becomes destructive. It represents a form of power that does not mirror the values of the existing order. It does not reassure. It intensifies. As the narrative foundation solidifies, Jean stands between two logics. One prioritizes stability through control. The other prioritizes truth through magnitude. The first offers safety at the cost of self-authorship. The second offers sovereignty at the cost of relational collapse. Neither path is neutral. The tension between them is not merely personal. It reflects a broader cultural discomfort with unmediated female power. Within the fictional universe, Jean's story is framed as exceptional, yet its symbolic structure is familiar. A woman of extraordinary capacity is praised for her potential while being subtly guided away from its full realization. Her power is aestheticized, moralized, and regulated. The Phoenix emerges as the narrative consequence of this contradiction, not its cause. The foundations of the conflict are therefore already complete. Jean's psyche has been shaped within an architecture that cannot accommodate the totality of what she carries. The Phoenix waits not as an invader, but as an inevitability. The question is no longer whether it will surface. The question is how violently the structure will resist when it does. The conflict takes shape not through a single rupture, but through accumulation. The narrative begins to shift when Jean's power is no longer merely impressive, but structurally inconvenient. Events unfold that require her to act beyond the margins previously assigned to her. Emergencies escalate. Threats exceed prediction. The system that once praised restraint now depends on her excess. This dependence marks the first visible fracture in the architecture of control. Jean is asked to do more. Not differently, more. Each request stretches the boundary she has learned to respect. Each crisis rewards the very intensity she has been trained to suppress. The contradiction becomes operational. She is still expected to remain contained, yet the survival of the collective increasingly relies on her capacity to exceed containment. Power is no longer theoretical. It becomes necessary. In these moments, the phoenix does not announce itself as rebellion. It appears as efficiency, as clarity under pressure, as the removal of hesitation. Jean responds faster, deeper, and with fewer internal negotiations. What once required mediation now moves directly from perception to action. The narrative frames this as growth, but the tone shifts. Something has changed in how force moves through her. The world responds with mixed signals. Success is celebrated, but followed immediately by concern. Admiration is paired with caution. The system praises results while questioning process. Jean is both indispensable and increasingly unsettling. Her actions solve problems too completely. They leave little room for deliberation or shared authorship. The balance of power subtly realigns. Psychologically, this stage is defined by dissonance. Jean experiences her expanded capacity as coherence. For the first time, her internal intensity matches her external expression. There is relief in this alignment, yet this relief is not mirrored by those around her. What feels like integration to her feels like escalation to the system. The gap between self-perception and social perception widens. The phoenix begins to function less as a latent pressure and more as an organizing principle. Jean's decisions carry a new weight. They are no longer tentative or provisional. She does not ask what is permitted. She assesses what is necessary. This shift unsettles the moral framework of the narrative, which has relied on consensus as a measure of legitimacy. Desire becomes more visible in this phase, not as romance or impulse, but as orientation. Jean begins to act in alignment with her own internal compass rather than external expectation. Her attachments deepen, but so does her willingness to override them when they conflict with her judgment. The system interprets this as emotional volatility. Jean experiences it as clarity. This divergence produces tension within relationships that once stabilized her identity. She is no longer simply supportive. She is directive. She no longer absorbs conflict. She resolves it. This alters the symbolic terrain. The center shifts. The gravity changes. Others must now orient themselves around her, rather than the reverse. Narratively, this is the point where neutrality collapses. The story can no longer sustain the illusion that Jean's power is merely an extension of collective will. Her actions generate consequences that cannot be distributed evenly. Responsibility begins to concentrate. With it comes scrutiny. The phoenix is increasingly named, if not yet fully understood. It is spoken of as influence, as amplification, as something that pushes Jean beyond herself. This language externalizes the source of discomfort, allowing the system to maintain its belief in Jean's essential compliance. If something is wrong, it must be because something has entered her, not because something has emerged from within. This framing serves a defensive function. It preserves the moral authority of those who once shaped her. It avoids confronting the possibility that their model of containment was incomplete. By attributing change to an external force, The system absolves itself of responsibility for the conditions that made the change inevitable. Jean, however, experiences the phoenix not as possession but as continuity. The boundaries between her intention and its execution continue to dissolve. She no longer feels divided between who she is and what she does. This internal coherence is intoxicating. It also isolates her. Events accelerate. Decisions that once would have been debated are now enacted. The narrative tempo increases. The stakes rise not because threats grow larger, but because responses grow more absolute. Jean's presence reshapes outcomes so decisively that alternatives disappear. This efficiency is read by some as leadership and by others as domination. The audience is drawn into this ambiguity. The story refuses to provide a stable moral vantage point. Jean's actions save lives. They also erode trust. The phoenix appears both as solution and as problem, depending on where one stands within the narrative field. This ambiguity is not accidental. It mirrors the cultural discomfort surrounding autonomous female power that does not seek validation. At this stage, the conflict is no longer latent. It has form. It has momentum. The system begins to react not to specific outcomes, but to the trajectory itself. Jean's direction feels irreversible. The question shifts from what she will do next to how far this path extends. The first stage of development concludes with a subtle but decisive shift. Jean is no longer being shaped by the structure around her. The structure is being forced to adapt to her. This reversal destabilizes the narrative foundation laid in the opening. The center is no longer secure. The phoenix has not yet consumed the stage, but it has claimed territory. The pressure that once remained internal now alters the environment. The world begins to reorganize itself in response to Jean's expanding gravity. What was once potential has become motion. What was once feared abstractly is now felt concretely. The conflict has taken shape, and it is no longer possible to pretend that it can be resolved through guidance alone. As the conflict deepens, the narrative shifts from accommodation to resistance. The system that once relied on Jean's expanding capacity begins to recognize that dependence has altered the balance of authority. What was tolerated as necessity now appears as threat. The same power that resolved crises too efficiently is reinterpreted as destabilizing. The terrain tightens. Surveillance increases. Language changes. Admiration gives way to concern, and concern quietly transforms into preparation. Jean feels this shift before it is spoken. The environment grows tense around her, not hostile yet, but guarded. Conversations pause when she enters a room. Decisions are delayed in her presence, then executed elsewhere. The stage that once welcomed her as an asset now positions her as an uncertainty. This is not punishment. It is containment reasserting itself under pressure. The phoenix responds not with retreat, but with expansion. Where resistance appears, intensity increases. Jean does not escalate out of malice. She escalates because escalation feels like coherence. The narrowing of external trust amplifies her reliance on internal judgment. The less she is consulted, the more decisively she acts. A feedback loop forms, driven by mutual mistrust. Narrative events reflect this tightening spiral. Threats emerge that cannot be neutralized without overwhelming force. Situations arise where hesitation would mean catastrophe. Jean steps forward instinctively, resolving conflicts before deliberation can intervene. Each success confirms her internal logic. Each reaction from others confirms her isolation. The gap widens. The phoenix becomes visible now not only in outcome, but in posture. Jean's presence carries weight before she acts. The environment bends preemptively. This shift in gravity unsettles those accustomed to shared authority. Power that no longer asks permission exposes the fragility of collective governance. The narrative begins to polarize. On one side stands a logic of protection through limitation. On the other, a logic of truth through magnitude. The first frames restraint as moral responsibility. The second frames it as denial. Jean is positioned between these poles, but increasingly aligned with the latter. Not because she rejects the collective, but because the collective has ceased to reflect her reality. Desire intensifies under this pressure, not as indulgence, but as assertion. Jean's emotional bonds deepen and harden simultaneously. She cares fiercely, but no longer allows care to override judgment. When loyalty conflicts with necessity, necessity wins. This choice is framed externally as coldness. Internally, it feels like integrity. The phoenix thrives in this environment because it resolves contradiction through dominance rather than compromise. Where Jean once negotiated between impulse and expectation, she now acts from a unified center. This unity is frightening not because it is chaotic, but because it is consistent. The narrative begins to frame her actions as excessive precisely because they are no longer divided. Attempts to intervene become more explicit. Boundaries are proposed, safeguards discussed, contingencies prepared. The language of trust is replaced by the language of risk management. Jean is not accused. She is assessed. This shift signals a profound rupture in relational terms. To be assessed is to be objectified. To be managed is to be stripped of authorship. Jean perceives this clearly. The phoenix responds accordingly. The more she is treated as a variable, the more she asserts herself as a constant. The narrative accelerates. Decisions are made faster. Outcomes grow more irreversible. Each move forces the next. The audience is placed in a difficult position here. Jean's actions remain effective. The threats are real. The solutions work. Yet the cost becomes harder to ignore. Relationships fracture. Trust erodes. The collective no longer recognizes itself in the outcomes she produces. The world is safer, but also narrower. Symbolically, this phase represents a contested territory. The center is no longer shared. It is occupied. Jean does not seize it deliberately. It collapses toward her because nothing else can hold. The phoenix functions as gravitational force rather than weapon. Its dominance emerges through inevitability, not conquest. The narrative refuses to offer moral clarity. Every attempt to limit Jean appears insufficient. Every attempt to trust her appears reckless. The system oscillates, unable to stabilize. This instability feeds the phoenix further. The more the world resists integration, the more it invites rupture. Jean's identity crystallizes under this pressure. She is no longer defined by role or relation. She is defined by capacity. This shift is irreversible. Once power becomes self-defining, it cannot be returned to mediation without violence. The story approaches a threshold. The second stage concludes as opposition hardens. What was once discomfort becomes strategy. What was once concern becomes preparation for containment. The narrative crosses a line where reconciliation is no longer assumed. The phoenix is no longer a question. It is a condition. The system braces itself. Jean advances. The center cannot hold. The conflict has moved beyond misunderstanding. It has entered the realm of collision. The collision does not begin with an attack. It begins with a decision, a moment in which restraint is no longer considered a virtue but an obstacle. The narrative crosses its most decisive threshold when Jean acts not in reaction to an external threat, but in anticipation of limitation. This is the point where the phoenix ceases to be a response and becomes a stance. The system moves first, not through force, but through architecture. Protocols are activated. Redundancies are installed. Authority is redistributed away from Jean under the language of safety. These measures are framed as precaution, but they function as displacement. The center is being reclaimed. Jean recognizes this immediately. The Phoenix recognizes it faster. What follows is not rebellion, but refusal. Jean does not argue for her place within the structure. She steps outside its logic entirely. The narrative reframes her actions as transgression because they no longer acknowledge the rules that once governed legitimacy. Power that operates without reference to permission is read as tyranny, regardless of intention. Events escalate with brutal clarity. Threats converge. Consequences compound. Jean's responses grow absolute. She does not seek consensus. She enacts resolution. The Phoenix now operates as total coherence, a state in which hesitation has been eliminated. Every action is aligned with perception. Every outcome is owned. This alignment produces devastation not because it is chaotic, but because it is uncompromising. Jean's decisions no longer leave space for others to participate meaningfully. The narrative world becomes streamlined around her will. This efficiency exposes a fundamental anxiety. A system built on shared governance cannot tolerate a singular axis of resolution, even when it is effective. Psychologically, this stage represents the collapse of mediation. The internal negotiations that once tempered Jean's actions have dissolved. What remains is direct expression. Desire and force are no longer separable. The Phoenix does not ask whether something should be done. It asks whether it can be done. If the answer is yes, the action follows. The world reacts with fear not because it is under attack, but because it has lost relevance. Jean no longer needs the structure that once defined her. This inversion destabilizes every relationship. Allies become liabilities. Mentors become obstacles. The narrative isolates her not through exile, but through transcendence. This isolation is not experienced as loneliness. It is experienced as clarity. Jean sees the terrain without distortion. She understands the cost of her actions, but no longer weighs them against approval. The Phoenix has resolved the internal conflict by eliminating the need for validation. What remains is a singular trajectory. The audience is confronted with the most uncomfortable question of the narrative here. If power saves the world, but erases the world as it was known, is it still salvation? The story refuses to answer. It forces the viewer to sit inside the contradiction. Jean's actions prevent catastrophe. They also dismantle the social fabric that defined meaning. Attempts to stop her emerge too late. Containment strategies escalate into confrontation. The language of care collapses into the language of necessity. Jean is no longer discussed as a person. She is discussed as an event, as a force that must be neutralized. This final objectification seals the rupture. The Phoenix responds with overwhelming finality, not as vengeance, but as inevitability. The narrative reaches its apex not in spectacle, but in consequence. Entire structures are undone in moments. The world is reshaped around Jean's presence, then fractured by its inability to coexist with it. This is the moment where the myth hardens. Jean is no longer a subject within the story. She becomes its axis. Her fall is not framed as punishment. It is framed as outcome. A system that could not integrate autonomous power produces its own catastrophe. The destruction is total not because Jean desires ruin, but because there is no longer a shared language through which restraint can operate. The Phoenix has removed the middle ground. What remains is polarity in its purest form. As the dust settles, the narrative does not offer relief. There is no return to equilibrium. The world that remains is quieter, smaller, and marked by absence. Jean's presence lingers not as memory, but as imprint. The terrain itself has been altered. Core development concludes not with closure, but with crystallization. The conflict has reached its most honest expression. The Phoenix has revealed what was always at stake. A system can either integrate autonomous power or be remade by its refusal to do so. The story moves forward carrying this truth like a scar. Once the immediate devastation subsides, the narrative reveals its deeper function. Jean Grey and the Phoenix no longer operate solely within the boundaries of their fictional universe. They migrate outward into the symbolic economy of culture itself. What remains is not simply a story of excess power or tragic fall, but a persistent disturbance in how autonomy, desire, and authority are collectively imagined. The Phoenix crystallizes a cultural anxiety that precedes the narrative and outlives it. The anxiety is not about destruction. It is about authorship. A figure who embodies overwhelming capacity and refuses mediation destabilizes the social grammar through which power is usually understood. Jean's transformation exposes how deeply legitimacy depends on consent to limitation. When that consent is withdrawn, the culture scrambles for interpretive control. The audience response mirrors the narrative's polarization. Some interpret Jean as corrupted, overtaken by something alien that distorts her essential goodness. Others read her as finally authentic, liberated from an architecture designed to dilute her force. This split is not accidental. It reflects a broader cultural tendency to moralize power only after it exceeds comfort. Power that serves is praised. Power that redefines terms is pathologized. The Phoenix functions as a symbolic amplifier. It does not invent Jean's traits. It magnifies them beyond the threshold of social accommodation. Desire becomes visible where it was once polite. Ambition becomes explicit where it was once disguised as duty. Authority becomes self-referential rather than delegated. The discomfort this produces is projected outward onto the Phoenix as monstrosity. This projection allows the culture to preserve its self-image. If Jean's excess is framed as possession rather than emergence, then the system's values remain intact. The narrative repeatedly attempts this maneuver. It speaks of corruption, of loss of self, of influence. These terms externalize responsibility and preserve the illusion that the original order was neutral rather than restrictive. Symbolically, Jean becomes a contested territory. Different groups claim her meaning according to their own investments. To some, she represents the danger of unchecked emotion. To others, the cost of repression. To some, she is cautionary. To others, prophetic. The Phoenix resists stabilization precisely because it exposes the instability of the frameworks trying to contain it. The gendered dimension of this symbolism is unavoidable. Jean's power is not merely immense. It is embodied in a female figure whose desire is neither purely relational nor self-sacrificial. The narrative repeatedly signals discomfort with this configuration. Power aligned with care is acceptable. Power aligned with self-direction is suspect. When Jean chooses necessity over attachment, the story marks the choice as transgressive rather than tragic. This framing resonates beyond the narrative. Cultural responses to female autonomy often follow a similar pattern. Ambition is reframed as excess, confidence as arrogance, decisiveness as coldness. Jean's arc condenses these dynamics into a mythic form. The Phoenix becomes the symbolic site where admiration turns into fear. The audience is invited to oscillate between identification and rejection. Jean is relatable until she is sovereign. She is celebrated until she no longer requires permission. This shift reveals a collective threshold. Empowerment is acceptable only while it remains reversible. Once it becomes irreversible, it threatens the symbolic center. Media environments intensify this effect. The phoenix is endlessly replayed, reinterpreted, and circulated. Each iteration sharpens its edges. The image of Jean consumed by fire becomes shorthand for danger, for loss of control, for catastrophe. The complexity of the arc is compressed into spectacle. Nuance collapses under repetition. Yet even in distortion, the myth persists. The phoenix refuses erasure. It continues to surface in discussions of power, agency, and collapse. Its endurance suggests that it articulates something unresolved. The story does not simply entertain. It troubles. Within the fictional universe, the phoenix alters how power is perceived. After Jean, containment is no longer assumed to be sufficient. The memory of her dominance lingers as a warning and a possibility. Structures are reinforced not only to prevent repetition, but to deny what was revealed. The narrative world learns the wrong lesson, mistaking cause for symptom. Culturally, the lesson remains contested. Some interpret the phoenix as evidence that power must be restrained at all costs. Others see it as evidence that restraint without integration produces disaster. The story offers no arbitration. It leaves the conflict unresolved, embedded in the audience's interpretive labor. The symbolic economy around Jean becomes saturated with moral signaling. She is invoked in debates about responsibility, leadership, and sacrifice. Her name becomes a reference point for discussing excess. This invocation often strips her of subjectivity, reducing her to outcome. The phoenix becomes a symbol detached from the psychological conditions that produced it. The symbolic economy around Jean becomes saturated with moral signaling. She is invoked in debates about responsibility, leadership, and sacrifice. Her name becomes a reference point for discussing excess. This invocation often strips her of subjectivity, reducing her to outcome. The phoenix becomes a symbol detached from the psychological conditions that produced it. This detachment is itself meaningful. It mirrors how cultures often deal with uncomfortable truths. Rather than examine the structures that generate rupture, they focus on the rupture itself. Jean's fall becomes the spectacle that absolves the system. The fire distracts from the pressure that ignited it. Yet the phoenix also functions as a counter-myth. For some, it represents a refusal to be diminished. A moment where power is not negotiated away. A vision of what happens when desire is allowed to fully inform action. This reading does not romanticize destruction. It recognizes it as consequence rather than intent. The endurance of this duality explains why the phoenix remains culturally active. It is not a closed story. It is a symbolic engine. It generates questions rather than answers. It resists domestication. In this sense, Jean Grey becomes more than a character. She becomes a lens through which cultural contradictions are magnified. Her arc forces an encounter with the limits of control, the cost of repression, and the fear surrounding unmediated power. The phoenix exposes the fragility of systems that rely on suppression rather than integration. The cultural impact of the phoenix is therefore not located in any single interpretation. It exists in the persistent inability to settle the narrative. Every retelling reopens the wound. Every adaptation renegotiates blame. The myth remains unstable because the conflict it embodies has not been resolved in the culture that consumes it. What the phoenix ultimately signifies is not destruction, but revelation. It reveals how quickly admiration turns into fear when power ceases to be useful and becomes sovereign. It reveals how desire is policed when it no longer serves relational harmony. It reveals how autonomy is tolerated only until it disrupts hierarchy. The story lingers because these dynamics remain operative. Jean Grey does not belong to the past. She occupies a fault line that continues to shift beneath contemporary culture. The phoenix burns not because it seeks to destroy, but because it illuminates what was always under tension. The cultural field absorbs this illumination unevenly. Some retreat, some confront, none remain untouched. The narrative prepares to move into its final phase not by resolving these meanings, but by allowing them to settle into myth. What follows is not aftermath in the conventional sense. It is sedimentation. In the aftermath, what remains is not resolution but architecture. The narrative world does not rebuild itself around Jean Grey. It builds itself away from her. The phoenix leaves behind a terrain reorganized by absence, defined as much by what has been lost as by what has been learned incorrectly. The silence that follows is not peace. It is compression. Jean's legacy is immediately reframed by those who survive her. Memory becomes selective. Her actions are separated from their context. The magnitude of her power is preserved, while the conditions that shaped its emergence are quietly erased. The story becomes easier to tell once complexity is removed. Catastrophe is attributed to excess, not to pressure. The system protects itself through simplification. This reframing performs an essential cultural function. By isolating Jean as anomaly, the narrative avoids interrogating its own design. The phoenix is remembered as eruption rather than accumulation, fire rather than weight. This allows the world to reinforce its existing structures without altering their foundations. The walls grow thicker, the rules grow tighter, the center becomes more rigid. Yet something irreversible has occurred. Even as Jean is reduced to cautionary symbol, her presence cannot be fully contained by memory. She has altered the imagination of power. After the phoenix, the possibility of unmediated force has been witnessed. It cannot be unseen. Every subsequent act of control carries the shadow of what control failed to prevent. Within the fictional universe, this manifests as heightened vigilance. Power is monitored earlier. Potential is identified sooner. Containment is no longer reactive but preemptive. The lesson learned is not integration but anticipation. The world responds by narrowing possibility rather than expanding understanding. This response stabilizes order at the cost of growth. Jean's figure lingers at the margins of this new order. She becomes a reference point invoked to justify restraint. Her name is used to end conversations rather than begin them. The phoenix is cited as proof that autonomy leads to ruin. In this way, her story is weaponized against those who resemble her, not in ability, but in orientation. Symbolically, Jean occupies a paradoxical space. She is remembered as both too much and not enough. Too powerful to be trusted, not restrained enough to be forgiven. This contradiction ensures that her legacy remains unresolved. The narrative cannot decide whether she was failure or inevitability. It settles for myth. As myth, Jean Grey functions as a permanent fracture in the cultural imagination. She embodies the fear that power might not require permission, that desire might not be negotiable, that authority might emerge from within rather than being conferred. These fears do not dissipate with her disappearance. They harden. The phoenix, stripped of its psychological depth, becomes an emblem. Fire, destruction, loss of control. Yet beneath this flattening, the original tension remains active. The myth continues to attract reinterpretation because it touches something unresolved. Each retelling attempts to close the wound. Each fails. In cultural terms, Jean's story persists because it exposes a limit that has not been crossed safely. the limit between empowerment and autonomy, between sanctioned strength and sovereign force, between being allowed to act and choosing to act. The phoenix marks the moment when that limit is breached, and the consequences are too great to integrate cleanly. There is no redemption offered in the aftermath, no return to balance. Jean does not become example of growth through sacrifice. She becomes evidence of incompatibility. The narrative insists that something had to give. It refuses to specify what. This ambiguity protects the system while haunting it. The enduring power of Jean Grey lies precisely here. Not in the spectacle of her fall, but in the clarity it produces. Her story reveals that containment without integration produces rupture. That admiration without trust breeds fear. That power denied authorship will seek expression regardless of cost. The phoenix does not symbolize evil. It symbolizes what happens when intensity is forced to operate without language, without consent, without shared meaning. It is the consequence of a world that could not imagine autonomy without catastrophe. Jean's tragedy is not that she fell. It is that there was nowhere for her to stand. As legacy, Jean Grey remains active. She operates as warning, as challenge, as unresolved question. Her story does not instruct. It exposes. It reveals the cost of systems that demand compliance from those they depend on. It reveals how quickly care becomes control when power refuses mediation. The aftermath does not close the narrative. It seals it into cultural memory. Jean's presence endures not as resolution, but as pressure. The phoenix continues to burn not on the page, but beneath the assumptions that govern how power is recognized and how autonomy is feared. What remains is not fire. It is weight, and the knowledge that, once revealed, it cannot be uncarried.